joining us tonight for Ans M Litter Frog in Conversation on Interdisciplinary Practice. My name's Annie. I produce and DJ under the name Ans M. I had an EP which came out on TT this January. Alongside this, I'm doing an MA in fashion at the Royal College of Art. A lot of my work sort of weaves between art and design, and I often work with video. But for the past year, I've been trying to focus primarily on research, and I'm interested specifically in looking at sort of socio-political issues within sustainable design and sort of the power structures behind new technologies.
Hi, my name's Martina, and I also produce music under the pseudonym Litter Frog. And my practice spans across music making, filmmaking, research, and activism. And my filmmaking and activism is primarily focused on the colonization of the Middle East, and specifically within Kurdistan, and also the colonization within the fossil fuel industry and climate justice in an intersectional framework. Just as a heads up, this talk is going to contain mentions of colonial violence, genocide, police brutality, and racism. And we're going to start off by showing a 3-minute clip from one of my films called Dog Dog Love You, which is about the colonization and the splitting up of Kurdistan. And then we're going to watch one of Annie's films called A Sublime Sky, A Technological Eye, which was shown earlier this year at an exhibition called Climate Knowledge at the Marmar Museum in Rotterdam. So if Josh, you could please put those 2 films up, that would be good.
Imagine thinking as a whole living system, alternative cosmologies from the defuturing technological present, vibrating stones absorbing the movement of the world, breathing bushes, waving grass, the world a living spirit, everything as parts of a whole.
A sublime sky, the prevalence of an all-seeing surveillance eye. I fly, a technological entity, the eye of a drone, ever-present technology. How radically anti-nature is this bird's eye vertical horizon? At first designed as a military killing machine, now surveillance far beyond the capabilities of humans' eyes. How easily I infiltrate the environment, how difficult it will be to find me, a nestling machine hiding in the mountains.
In several Chinese classical texts, there's a concept called 感应, a cosmological resonance between all entities, a stimulus and response, actions and mutually echoing reactions. 夫物类之相应，玄妙深微，知不能论，辩不能解，故东风至而九丈异，长而思而三弦绝，或感之也。化随灰而月晕却，精于死而会心出，或动之也。神气相应，真矣。故山云草满，水云鱼鳞，汉云烟火，层云波水，各象其形类，所以感之。
Yeah, I really love that video, Martina. I find it really powerful the way you've used the dog, like a dog's perspective, dogs which are like arguably one of the most attention-grabbing things on the internet, to sort of engage conversation about colonial histories. And so this slide shows some screenshots from your dissertation, which also followed this format of speaking through the perspective of a dog. So I was wondering if you could tell us more about this and how you use this to sort of specifically challenge perspectives from the global north.
Cool. Thanks, Annie. So yeah, that film and another film which I made are both centered around the dissertation I wrote on my fine art BA called A Dog's Independence, and the dissertation was written from the perspective of Darko, who is the dog on the first page of the dissertation. And Darko is an Iraq War veteran who was an explosives detective canine dog, and he was essentially rescued by ex-US Marine military personnel and taken back to Florida. And I basically found this Facebook page, and I found it really interesting that people who are willing to go to another country and murder thousands and thousands of people and be complicit in horrific war crimes had this level of empathy for another being who, whilst they deserve the same amount of respect, I found it like incredibly interesting how these people from the, I guess, a conservative place within the global north valued these lives so much more than other lives. So I basically framed my dissertation around different posts from Darko's Facebook and used the same kind of language as the US Marines used to speak from Darko's perspective. And I basically just went through a story based on the colonization of Kurdistan and the English and French, I guess, their imperial regime, which led to them making the decision to split up Kurdistan into 4 different countries, making them an incredibly vulnerable people who have been subjected to genocide after genocide from, I guess, all the countries and different, I guess, scenarios within those different countries that they have been placed within. So I think I was hoping that by using this figure who seems to really tug on the heartstrings of these people, it might cause people to question the privilege they have and the history and the genocide and the violence that those histories are placed upon, and to maybe actively engage in some kind of restitution with the communities who their privilege has negatively impacted on. Sorry, it's been a long time in isolation, so it's weird talking to people, but yeah, I hope that helps answer your question, Annie.
Yeah, and it's especially disturbing looking at the George Bush painting dogs picture. But yeah, so our next slide, we're sort of going on to some work I've been doing recently, which is also, well, it was part of my MA dissertation. So my dissertation was called Spectres of Technological Futures, and I was sort of interested in looking at speculative fictions to like critique the power structures within these futures. I was looking at the way technology often serves as like a tool to uphold and intensify capitalist and military industrial power, and how under like the guise of innovation and this line of projection from like Eurocentric modernity is basically just hiding different power structures and exploitation. So following on from the dissertation, I sort of illustrated several scenes within it. So the first scene is set at an automated garment factory. I was looking at a philosopher called Yu Hui, who writes about cosmotechnics, and he's sort of trying to highlight the cosmological conditions within each culture that produce technical thinking. And this is in order to just like sort of challenge Eurocentric mentality behind a lot of this. So in the first image, Lei Gong and Dianmu, who are the Lord of Thunder and Mother Lightning within Chinese mythology, they sort of look at the automated factory and sort of question the history of China's adoption of Western technology. I'm sort of interested in seeing how even automated garment machines have also directly come from the US military. So following the 2002 Berry Amendment, which basically restricted the US military from obtaining and using uniforms that weren't made in the US, they found that there weren't enough like skilled garment machinists in the US to fulfill that. So they really boosted sort of funding into automation, and this is sort of carried through into commercial applications. So now Adidas uses those machines. There's other machines from a brand called Yuho, which are used in Nagasaki prison, and prisons basically make guard uniforms using them because they require like, they're a lot easier to use than traditional machines. Uniqlo uses them too, and there's a lot of like projections of like how many jobs might be lost. So the International Labour Organization sort of estimates that 137 million people might lose their job in Southeast Asia alone, just from automated garment machines. And then this scene from the slide that's now showing, this is a scene where I was sort of investigating e-waste dumps, and I was looking a lot at Donna Haraway and Anna Tsing's writing and how they sort of look at recuperation and multi-species collaboration amongst capitalist ruins. So in this scene, 2 children find like an abandoned care robot at an e-waste facility, and the care robot contains like a disembodied memory of an experimental farmer. So together they start playing with like algae farming, cockroach farming, working with mushrooms and different sort of non-human elements that are known for their resilience. So yeah, just trying to like look for different possibilities of like interplay and collaboration within e-waste, which is one of the largest waste streams currently growing.
Well, thanks, Annie. I find these images so interesting to look at. And I guess I wanted to ask you more about the process behind creating them, and also the process behind the research that goes into creating these images, because I know a lot of your research has been based along capitalist lines of production and the people and the ecology who are massively affected by those lines of production. So I'd be interested to hear more about both of those things.
Yeah, so I think I'd say something that's really influenced me in making this work is the AI Now Institute's Anatomy of an AI. So they've basically traced Amazon Echo and sort of traced from the mineral extractivism right at the beginning through all the different streams of labor that are global, all the way to the end at e-waste dumps. And I was like really like amazed at like sort of how vast and like exploitative this, like such a small seeming device has really gone through so many different processes. And I was interested how that sort of works in tandem with like the fashion capitalist supply chains. So basically all of these images have been inspired by my research, and the research has come first. So I was looking a lot at sort of different industry media around technologies, journals, books that are looking at like social environmental angles of these technologies. I read some Marxist analysis of AI and cybernetics. I was looking at techno-orientalism studies. And I've been really influenced by people like Arturo Escobar and Sasha Constanza Chock, who sort of look at discrimination within technology as a problem of design and like sort of working within that. In terms of the actual making for these, this was like the first time I've ever really just made something on a computer with no drawing or 3D before. So I was working a lot with Illustrator and Photoshop and sort of doing a lot of collage within it, trying to basically make them look a bit more 3D through shading, bevel and emboss tool on Photoshop. But yeah, I'm hoping, this is still very much like a work in progress. I'm hoping to develop it more into like longer text and like longer stories in the next year. So yeah, I hope that's answered your question. So now we're gonna go back to Martina's practice, looking at her curation for the exhibition I Am BP, King of Exploitation, King of Injustice. Would you be able to like talk about this project and sort of give us some like background information specifically about why BP is so terrible within the histories of Iraq and Kurdistan?
Well, thank you, Annie, and thank you for your answer. It's really interesting. With this specific exhibition, it was I curated alongside two other curators, Shahla Omar and Ibtihal Hussein, and it was done in collaboration with the protest group BP or Not BP, who I have continued to be involved with, and I will talk about a bit more later. But this exhibition was done in conjunction with the protest No War, No Warming, which was held at the British Museum in February 2019, and was basically kind of a protest around BP's sponsorship of an exhibition called I Am Ashurbanipal, King of the World, King of Assyria. And we were basically kind of exposing the hypocrisies behind a company like BP claiming to want to support Assyrian culture, a culture which is in part from modern day Iraq. And so we basically exposed a lot of FOI evidence, which was kind of found out through research by someone called Greg Muttit, and is available to view via Google if you just search fuel on the fire. And basically BP actively lobbied for the Iraq war so that they could get a contract in the Rumaila oil field in Basra in southern Iraq. And within this alternate exhibition, we showcase 17 Iraqi artists from a variety of different backgrounds. So we also had some Kurdish artists who were unfortunately situated within what is currently Iraq, but it was kind of the framework of within those set borders which have been created. And this specific artist called Khalid Tawfiq Hadi is based in Basra. And these are photographs from the riots in Basra in the summer of 2018, where protesters took to the street demanding clean water and an end to youth unemployment and an end to corruption, which is something that has continued to be seen throughout Iraq. And I think there's just a lot of hypocrisies that need to be highlighted when it comes to a company like BP operating in one of the world's largest oil wells in a part of the world where the majority of the local community are living in poverty and in no way benefiting from those oil reserves. So we were essentially highlighting the hypocrisy behind BP claiming to support those cultures on a surface level by sponsoring an exhibition which is promoting that culture, when in reality this is what they're doing to the people who and the communities who live in those parts of the world today. And I've also included Khalid's Instagram and Twitter handle, and I'd highly recommend you follow him because he has posts a lot of really important information and photographs. So I'd recommend going and following him. And I have one more image, which is another film. Unfortunately, I can't talk about all the pieces in the exhibition because we'd be here all night. But this film was another piece in the exhibition that I really loved, called Amid the Alien Chord by Qasim Abid. And this is a documentary made in the 1990s of 7 Iraqi artists who fled Iraq because of persecution from Saddam Hussein's regime and basically sought asylum within Italy. And this documentary is available to watch on Vimeo, and I'd also highly recommend you watch it. It's probably one of my favorite films I've ever watched, and it basically just really beautifully illustrates the diaspora experience for artists fleeing a dictatorship. And there's also been a second film made this year, which is the same 7 artists 30 years on, which I don't think is available to watch on Vimeo, but I watched it at a screening and it's absolutely incredible. And I think as well, when it comes to a country like a company like BP, there is so much colonial history within their practice and within their extraction. And if you look at BP's history, for example, within Iran, BP founded themselves as the Anglo-Persian Oil Company and absolutely destroyed that part of the world. And a fellow artist and friend called Tara White has written an incredible piece of research on the Anglo-Persian Oil Company and essentially what they have done to the communities within that part of the world. And if you want to get in touch with them to find out a bit more about their research, their Instagram is really bad. So WHEELYBAD. And yeah, I'd highly recommend researching that part of history and the legacy behind BP, not only on an environmental level, which absolutely disproportionately affects people within the global south, but the colonial practice of their extraction, which is essentially a human rights abuse from every angle you look at it. So I hope that demonstrates why BP are such a hideous company. I'm going to move on to a screenshot from one of Annie's films called Compost Daddy, which actually turned into an internet meme sensation, which I think is absolutely amazing. But I think behind the kind of imagery of this film, there's a much darker message, which is about the greenwashing and the colonization and the racism within the fashion industry, which I think ties into the way that all companies, including BP, work within a capitalist framework. And I'd be really interested to hear more, Annie, about the research that went into this film and I guess more of the research on the fashion industry within a colonial framework as well.
Yeah, so I made this film right at the end of my BA, which is also in fashion at CSM. It was sort of like a culmination of like all my frustrations about the industry, and sort of finding that like even within sustainable fashion, there's still such little discourse about the colonial foundations, appropriation, and like everything terrible that the fashion industry is built upon. There's a lot of brands sort of focus on just sort of performative ecological sustainability and don't really address the lack of ethics, fair wages, outsourcing of labor that has sort of produced the crisis we're in. So it's often noted that like the fashion industry at the moment is still pretty much exactly the same as it was in the height of colonization. So all the trade routes like are pretty much identical. So within this piece, this was like using one of my final collection's looks. So my final collection, I sort of just wanted to like sort of take the piss a bit and like poke fun at the industry. I made 6 different things that were like made out of upcycled materials, which you could use and basically become some sort of product, or you'd like supposedly connect with nature, sort of looking at the way that a lot of brands sort of conflate like outdoors, be like stuff like that, with sustainability very wrongly. So this whole piece is made from wind sails that are like broken wind sails that I obtained from outdoor centres around London, and all the PVC is from just studio scraps. All the finishings are taken from broken secondhand tents, and it's just filled with compost. You can just go in there, sort of connect. So yeah, basically, I don't know, I guess the research I'm sort of trying to look at now, sort of trying to really go deeper into like the issues that are within sustainable fashion. So for example, recycling is often used as a way of like high street brands sort of like trying to like get a better image. For instance, H&M have had several campaigns where they ask people to bring in their old clothes to be recycled, but they give them new shopping vouchers to use. And most clothing can't be recycled because the current recycling technologies can't separate out polyblends. Most recycled fabric comes from pre-consumer waste. So people like, for instance, the offcuts from production where the manufacturer knows exactly what the fabric is, and then they can like melt it down if it's polyester, or spin it into something else if it's wool. And I think in the past year, there's been a big conflation of vegan clothing as ethical, when things have just been swapped for plastic, and they're still like, especially on like websites such as ASOS, where they're still selling the shoes for like £12. There's like no way it could actually have been ethically made and people have been paid correctly for that. There's also lots of different issues within new materials that are sort of promoted as being more sustainable as older ones. So for instance, viscose and rayon are quite often like talked about in terms of sustainability for using less water, being biodegradable. But because of the sort of surge in interest in this, this has led to rainforests in Indonesia being cleared to grow the softwood to make this. And then another issue, which is becoming more and more prominent, I think, is just carbon offsetting as a way of buying accountability, I guess. So a lot of brands, like 2 seasons ago, started promoting that they were like carbon zero just by carbon offsetting. So Kering Group, Gucci, Burberry all have done this. If you look at work by Naomi Klein, you can see how she talks about carbon offsetting in many cases is a sort of form of climate colonialism, whereby countries in the global north are buying up land in the global south just for the sole purpose of planting trees for carbon offsetting. So Norway is known to have bought up a lot of land in East India. In Uganda, there's been a lot of documentation of land being blocked for local residents, for people from the global north to plant forests in. It's just like, obviously these brands should be giving money to like environmental causes, but they're not making any real structural changes within the company and just paying off very vague figures and not sort of giving any information about what they're doing, and people are praising them for being supposedly sustainable. And then I guess also last year, Extinction Rebellion called for a boycotting of fashion. And a lot of people said that this is just not the right way to go about it, because essentially these boycotts are going to harm the people who have like the most precarious livelihoods. And I guess this has really been like clarified in COVID-19, where a lot, because of the vast drop in shopping at the beginning, has led to cancellation of orders abroad. Like people, like a lot of big brands have cancelled orders that were already made. They've left factory workers abroad in such a shit situation. So it's clear that that's not the right way to go about this. Also, government legislation hasn't really done anything. The UK government sort of commissioned it was the Environmental Audit Committee to do like a report on how to fix fast fashion, sort of come up with tips of how to make the industry cleaner, and all of their suggestions were rejected by the government. This even included stuff, things, help like strategies to minimize child slavery, modern day slavery, taxing like 1p per garment to go towards sustainability researching, and all of these were rejected. So it's not a very happy place to be researching at the moment. I would say if anyone's sort of interested in looking at sustainable fashion, Celine Siman is a really key speaker within this, who sort of really underlies the sort of colonial foundations of the fashion industry, which is something I've found quite hard to like find within sustainable fashion discourse. But yeah, so all this sort of talk about greenwashing and climate colonialism sort of links in with our next slide, which is Martina's work with BP or not BP. So this image from a action this year, BP Must Fall. So Martina, do you want to talk about like your role within this? What are the group's demands, and sort of explain this action that happened at the British Museum earlier this year?
Yeah, thanks, Annie. I think there are a lot of interesting links to draw between the fashion and the fossil fuel industry, which I'll explain in a bit. But just as a brief outline, so the group BP or not BP, I've been involved with them for I think about a year and a half, and if not longer. And we basically protest fossil fuel sponsored cultural institutions within the UK, because fossil fuel companies use their sponsorship of these incredibly important institutions as a way to lobby governments to prevent climate action, and in order to host meetings, to secure different oil contracts with various governments, including incredibly oppressive regimes, which I guess I've talked about a bit, but I'll talk about a bit more. So basically the group's aims are to take away BP's lobbying power within those institutions. And I think what is quite interesting that Annie was just talking about in terms of greenwashing within the fashion industry has definitely been replicated within the fossil fuel industry, and I guess specifically with BP, who I guess my research primarily focuses on, where BP appointed a new CEO earlier this year, and their CEO is called Bernard Looney, and he has basically rebranded the company as going net zero by 2050, and a lot of the company's PR has been focused on this campaign, and it fails to recognise that BP is 97% invested in fossil fuels, less than 3% of their investments go into renewable energy, and moreover they have plans to expand their fossil fuel production 20% over the next decade, and their plans for a carbon neutral 2050 are reliant on technology which doesn't currently exist. So similarly, there are a lot of places where this research kind of gets stuck because there really doesn't seem to be any kind of positive solution. But as a group, we're trying to reduce BP's lobbying power and I guess focus on the British Museum. where BP gets a lot of positive PR from sponsoring their flagship shows, even though their sponsorship is less than 0.5% of the British Museum's annual funding. So these photographs are from the protest BP Must Fall earlier this year, which was in protest of a Troy-sponsored BP exhibition. And as a group, we have a ethos of frontlining people on the front lines of climate change and fossil fuel colonialism. So we had speakers from the Free West Papua campaign and from Senegalese anti-corruption campaigners, and also the area that I was most involved in, which was activists from Kurdistan and from Turkey, because BP has been involved in building 2 massive pipelines in collaboration with the Turkish government, therefore propping up their racist, fascist, genocidal regime, and specifically kind of focusing on the Baku Tbilisi Ceyhan pipeline, which was built between 2003 and 2005, and which was built across Kurdish majority areas within Turkey. And during that process, Kurdish villagers were evicted from their lands and from their livelihoods, and their recompensation was an amount of money which was equivalent to the price of a cup of tea. And anyone who spoke out, anyone who fought against this, was met by fierce police brutality and torture by Turkish police, which I think illustrates just how BP is complicit in this really violent, racist, genocidal dictatorship. And BP was actually charged with human rights abuses for that pipeline build in 2011, but they still built a second pipeline in collaboration with the Turkish government called the Trans-Anatolian Pipeline, which was completed in the summer of 2019. So we're trying to kind of bring these narratives to the kind of foreground of the discussion around climate justice, because I think they're narratives that are often forgotten. And in order to kind of really get a media hook on these protests, we built a 4-meter high Trojan horse in a way of sieging the museum and creating, I guess, a massive piece of protest performance art. So hopefully I could talk about BP for hours, but I'll pass over back to Annie because
before we move on, I wanted to ask sort of what advice you'd give to people who want to be more involved in activism and sort of get involved with activist groups such as BP or not BP.
Yeah, the advice I would give to people is to maybe do some research online. I guess it's more difficult to do this at the moment, but I would suggest to just go along to a couple of protests organised by groups you're interested in and just work out which groups your ethos is really aligned with, and then kind of, I guess, get in touch with people. Every organisation has a contact email on their website, so just get in touch with them and find out what the process is about being involved. I think it's also very important before you get involved in a group to understand how their internal structures work, what exactly your role within an organising group would be, just to make sure that everything is kind of clear and opaque. But essentially just find a group who your ethos really aligns with and be prepared for a lot of admin, is all I can really say. I'm going to move on to a screenshot from Annie's film, which we watched earlier, which I think presents a lot of really interesting points around capitalist lines of production, and also kind of goes into technology, specifically with drones, which have a military use, which is, I guess, another way that technology is being used to prop up an incredibly violent imperialist world. And I know that, Annie, you've done a lot of research on artificial intelligence and other forms of technology and how they sit within a racist, capitalist, imperialist system. So I'd be really interested to know more about the research which goes into So I guess the research which you've done and how those technologies are being used to exacerbate these oppressive systems that we sit within, and also what research has kind of uncovered in terms of, I guess, anti-racist AI and different ways that this technology can be used to fight these systems as well.
Yeah, so I guess like the most visibly obvious way that AI is sort of facilitating racism within policing and borders is through like machine learning decision making. So this is stuff such as predictive policing, facial recognition. It also goes into stuff like predictive lending from banks for like picking who to give like mortgages to, stuff like that. So the problem with these systems is that they are formed, basically they learn from past data, and obviously within the police and imprisonment industry, all of that is incredibly racist and biased. So these technologies are sort of learning from racist histories, but these systems are being sold as progressive and neutral and more accurate than human judgment because they're machines. And this sort of forms like invisible power structures that are very hard to challenge, and people are profiting off these systems. Like Amazon sells facial recognition software. A very often quoted sort of statistic about this is, for instance, California's gang database is 87% Black and Latinx communities, and it's flagged up incorrectly so many babies that are under the age of 1 just because of their zip code and their name. And then the American Civil Liberties Union tested Amazon's recognition, which is a different software, to sort of see the discrepancies within it, and they were trying to call for a moratorium for law enforcement use. So when they tested it in 2018, they found that basically to test it, they put in members of Congress to try and see what the system would identify them. And it incorrectly matched 28 members of Congress, and disproportionately, these were people of color. So there's a lot of people sort of working within those areas. For instance, Data for Black Lives has a project called Abolish Big Data. So this goes in line with all the sort of wider necessary calls for abolition and defunding the prison industrial complex. They want to take sort of these big data machine learning powers away from the sort of hands of the police and border control, because there's no way to make them non-racist, because even if you don't put in people's race as a category for learning, they can still guess people's races from like their background, from their address, from stuff like that. So there's a lot of groups sort of working on how to design these systems differently. One of them is Design Justice Network. There's a new book called Design Justice that came out this year that's really good at sort of highlights a lot of different frameworks of how to center equity within design. And this is sort of transferable across all different design frames, but specifically within systems design, things like completely deconstructing the idea of the presupposed user, and sort of trying to figure out different ways that the community can be involved in creating systems, sort of teaching community AI tools and stuff like that, and not just leaving it in the hands of like the sort of privileged few who are controlling the AI industry at the moment. There's a lot of work sort of suggesting that because China and the US have the biggest funded AI projects, and companies such as Amazon are buying up smaller AI companies. So a lot of people are predicting like a sort of power hold held by the US, China, and like just several few companies. So a lot of other groups that are interesting to look at for work in this are the Algorithmic Justice League, Data Justice Lab, the Digital Equity Lab, Black in AI, Detroit Digital Justice Coalition. There's a lot of like incredible books about this. If anyone wants a reading list, they can message me. And in terms of different ways of using it, obviously within AI, there's like a lot of possibilities and like ways to sort of disrupt what it's normally used for. Like machine learning is another product of the US military. So there's this artist called Stephanie Dinkins, whose work I think is really incredible. They produced an AI storyteller based off like 3 generations of their like Black family history, and the AI storyteller is sort of becoming like a multi-generational memoir and sort of continuously learning and storytelling. So I think that's like a really interesting way that it's been used within sort of like a storytelling arts context. A lot of people are doing work within AI and climate modeling, looking at sort of predictions for climate change. But within that, again, you need to be careful that AI and these sort of like advanced computing systems are incredibly energy intensive. And then also, if anyone's interested in looking at this from like an arts perspective, James Bridle has a really interesting podcast called New Ways of Seeing, and he sort of touches on a lot of different like cybernetic systems and AI within the arts and how artists are sort of looking at these issues. But yeah, so hope that's summed up some information. There's obviously a lot of research within that and I'm still learning about. But yeah, so we're sort of like coming towards the end of our sort of talk. So to finish our section, we wanted to show you Silvertoe Sanctuary, which Martina's been running. So yeah, do you want to talk about the work you do with that and like sort of how it started? Yeah.
Thanks, Annie. Yeah, me and my sister founded Silvertoe Sanctuary this year, and it all started with 2 gerbils who really needed a home, and then we kept finding more victims of the pet industry who were desperately in need of homes, and we found that we had capacity to share our homes with these animals. So basically we are currently caring for 32 mice, 5 gerbils, 2 cats who were previous residents, and 1 rat who we rescued a couple of weeks ago, and we're currently, we're going to be adopting 3 baby rats who were rescued from a breeder on Monday, because the rat we rescued was kept by himself in a tiny cage for the majority of his life. So we are getting him some friends, and he lives in my bedroom with me. He's not kept in a cage, and it's very sweet sharing your room with a rat, because he is incredibly sweet. He jumps on my bed in the middle of the night and starts nibbling my toes. I don't have a photo of him, but if you want to see more photos, you can follow Silvertoe Sanctuary on Instagram. But I guess that's where a lot of my energy has been going recently. So thank you all for watching, and thank you so much to TT and the whole TT team for organising these series of talks and having us here. And we just wanted to open up if anyone had any questions, and if you have any questions, just put them in the Twitch message chat, and they're going to be posted over to us so we can answer any questions that you might have.
So yeah, Martina, maybe I can read out some of the questions we have so far. Okay, so the first one, Thanks. What is the role of sound in the research process for your video work?
Do you want to start, or shall I start?
You can start.
Okay, so the clip of the film we just watched is actually the first piece of sound I ever made, and I started making sound as an accompaniment for my films because I kept finding that I really wanted a specific sound to go with the films I was making, and I couldn't find them on the internet, so I started making different music, which then turned into me independently producing as Litter Frog and playing gigs in that capacity. But I guess the music making kind of came as a tool for creating some kind of atmosphere for the information within my films to be engaged with. And with anytime I show a film, I'll create a whole installation, and the sound is very much like an external kind of I guess installation piece, I guess, object within that installation. So I think, yeah, I use sound as a vessel to help people engage with, I guess, some difficult topics. So hopefully that answers the question. But I also do a lot of field recordings. So I've got a lot of field recordings that I've taken back in Kurdistan of lots of different things, which I also use as part of my production process as well.
Yeah, I think the sound for the video you showed is incredible at the beginning. I really love it. I guess my sound within my video work, I think it's probably like more so the other way around, where I think a lot of ideas I have for like songs and things I like to explore usually come when I'm at galleries and like seeing other video work, I'm really inspired by people's soundtracks. I think they're so powerful and strong, and I think that really inspires my actual music. I don't know if I think for the most part, a lot of my own sort of sound within my videos is sort of just like things I have lying around, because I guess I have like a very big mass of like Ableton files, so trying to like sort of find uses for bits, but yeah, I guess that's the way I work. And then yeah, so we have another question which I guess is probably more suited for you, Martina. What's it like balancing organizing and creative practice? What challenges have you experienced so far?
So yeah, that's a very good question, and yeah, there's a good reason that I haven't released. I have produced more music, but haven't released any new music since my TT EP. Although I did release another piece earlier this year, but I think it's incredibly difficult to balance, because it's not only balancing the organising with the music, it's balancing that alongside a job which is necessary for some kind of income coming in. So it's definitely difficult. And I found like a lot of days where I would be working in an office and then I would have like a hour commute over to another facility nearby, and then I would have a 3-hour planning meeting for an action, and that was just kind of my life for a while. So it was very hard to find music, like time to actually have creative practice. But what I've kind of found is that creativity that I have kind of is able to come through within the actions that I'm helping to organise. And I found protest as a form of expressing that creativity and expressing those politics that I personally find really important. So I guess it's more that my medium's kind of moved over from music and film, although I'm still incredibly passionate about them, but that kind of energy has also moved into protest organisation as well, which is another incredibly important medium to express ideas with and actively engage people. And I found it so liberating that I could express those ideas and things that I was concerned about in a way which was so tangible, as opposed to music and film, which sometimes feels like it's struggling to engage with things outside of its own bubble.
And then yeah, the last question, unless anyone wants to ask anything else, add it in the box. Was there a particular moment which felt like a turning point for you getting more involved in activism and organising?
Do you want to answer that first?
Oh, I guess I feel like I haven't really been involved in activism and organising really as much as I would like to, and it's something that I'm really interested in, like trying to go more into. I think I've been mostly just researching, because I think there's just so many problems within like the industries that I'm interested in, and most of the discourse in those issues is just looking at the issues and there's hardly any solutions. So that's what I've been trying to like focus on. But yeah, I guess the real turning point for that, I guess I've always been sort of worried and upset about climate change. And then I guess in like my first and second year on my BA, I sort of started looking at sustainability. And I think I went on like a factory visit, well, several factory visits, like one to like one of the biggest shirt manufacturing companies in the world, which was in China. I found that very shocking and like hard to see. It was like, I mean, it was like very good in terms of like a factory level, but just certain things really upset me, like the way they were, to conserve energy, they left their heat presses on 24/7 so that there was no time wasted, no heat wasted turning it off and on, which meant people did 12-hour shifts sort of day and night. Yeah, that was quite like an eye-opener to me, sort of looking at when people sort of can like optimizing and energy saving sort of over like workers' health. And then when I was doing my placement year, I like lived in a factory for half a year in Shanghai. And I think after that, I was really like, okay, I really want to like really just research sustainability and look at technologies. And yeah, my interest in sustainable fashion sort of led to me being interested in technologies, because it's such like prevalent solution that's often wielded for a lot of climate change issues, stuff like geoengineering, AI. I feel like you can find articles that say AI is going to save literally everything in any single industry. But yeah, that's how I sort of got interested in that. Yeah, do you want to talk about that question as well?
Yeah, I think the tipping point for me is probably on becoming more engaged in, I guess, different issues, and then I guess the realization that the way that we live within the global north has such negative impacts on people living within the global south, and just feeling like a personal responsibility that because of the privilege that the society we live in holds, whilst there are a lot of different issues which massively negatively affect people, we still hold a level of privilege in terms of the carbon emissions that we produce just through our day-to-day lives, and how those massively negatively affect people in the global south, and a personal responsibility to actually do something about that because we're responsible for holding those systems up. So I think the tipping point for me was when I was visiting an IDP camp in Kurdistan. I do a lot of work with a charity called Joint Help for Kurdistan, who runs medical clinics for Yazidi IDPs, and just seeing IDPs who have survived an ISIS genocide living in camps without any kind of basic necessities, including air conditioning and 50 degrees heat, and just thinking that all of these systems that have led to this to happen to these people is because of the imperialist world that we live in, and the colonialism that we, just by existing within the global north, are profiting from in some way. So I guess hopefully that answers the question. And sorry, I realised it's got really dark in here, so hopefully you can still see me.
Yeah, are there any more questions in the chat? I guess if there's no more questions, I guess we can wrap this up. So just want to say thank you again to everyone at CUT for sort of organising this and helping with all the technical and stuff. I know it's a lot of work involved. And thank you, Martina. I've learned a lot from you and like really enjoyed talking to you today.
Cool. Thank you, Annie. And yeah, likewise. I think I've said this to you before, but I really want to read more of your research. So hopefully I'll be able to do that at some point soon.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.